It's November 20, Ukraine Media Center starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko, and now we'll have a press conference and a presentation of the Moscow Convention on treatment of prisoners of war. Joining us in the studio are Dmytro Lubinets, Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, Oleh, Hushchyn, representative of the Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War, Yevheniia Synelnyk, representative of the Association of Azovstal Defender Families, Tetiana, Katrychenko, Executive Director of the Media Initiative for Human Rights, Bogdan Chumak, Advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and about to join us online will be Yuliia Paievska, also known as Taira, liberated, paramedic, and volunteer. So let's start our conversation. We're talking about Moscow Conventions on treatment of prisoners of war, but all the world is aware of the Geneva Conventions on treatment of prisoners of war. It's been 10 years of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia keeps neglecting the rules of Geneva Conventions. They invented their rules for treatment of prisoners of war. So, Mr. Dmytro, let's start with you. Can you please tell us what do we mean by this title, the Moscow Conventions, and how exactly Russian Federation violates all of the international laws? Thank you very much for having me. Good morning, dear journalists, all the participants of this event. You're absolutely right. More than 10 years, Russian Federation has been publicly and consciously violating international humanitarian law and Geneva Conventions in particular. I think that not so much people know that the international agreements were laid as foundations of Geneva Conventions, and they were developed back in 19th century, and the Geneva Conventions, as we know them, they got their shape after the end of the Second World War, in my opinion, to identify the clear rules, even in the case of international conflict. It should be clearly set forth that the countries undertake obligations to treat the civilians and the prisoners of war who end up close to the front lines with dignity. But unfortunately, within the last 10 years, Geneva Conventions, instead of being effective, there is a bill against cruelness. So Geneva Conventions turned into a bill that deprives you of sight. Everybody says that Russian Federation consciously violates the rights of Ukrainian prisoners of war. But what's after that? There is an impression that the world has gotten blind. On one hand, they talk about it, but on the other hand, nobody does anything about it. That's why we've come up with the idea to present the Moscow Conventions that Russian Federation complies with. Let me demonstrate you this document. It will be presented today, and publicly we will launch an awareness campaign to draw the attention of everybody, all countries all over the world, to Moscow Conventions, because Geneva Conventions for Russian Federation just don't exist. The world perceives it either consciously or subconsciously. In my opinion, documents like this are supposed to demonstrate what are the rules that exist for Russian Federation, not for the whole civilized world, but for the Russians in particular. The standards of Moscow Convention on treatment of prisoners of war is a document that describes 15 stories of the liberated prisoners of war. I urge everybody to read those stories, and believe me, as you read these stories, you don't even get goosebumps, but sometimes you fail to comprehend how people can treat other people so cruelly. The title of Moscow Convention is the eloquent title, in our opinion, and it's an indicator that this document is a kind of anti-utopia ideology where the control over the fear of violence have become the key tools of management of people whom Russia keeps captive. In my opinion, Moscow Conventions are supposed to demonstrate to the whole world that it's a challenge for all of them, not only for Ukrainians, because shouldn't there be the reaction on part of the world? Everybody should clearly understand there will be next country in relation to which Russia will act the same, other nationalities, other countries, because it's not the rules of Russia's war against Ukraine. Those are the rules of Russian attitude to everybody. And then we've analyzed when Russian Federation has occupied part of Moldova back in 1992. They were treating the civil population in the same way when Russian Federation was committing crimes during the First and Second Chechen War, when Russian Federation was committing aggression against Georgia. The same principles of treatment of civilians and prisoners of war were applied back then. This is why we want to publicly present this document. Well, we were registered, we were beaten, electrocuted, we were beaten on our hands, on our legs, with everything that they got at their hand. Those are the words of former prisoner of war, Alexei Kretsev. On top of enduring beating, he got sick with tuberculosis because he was intentionally put in a cell with those sick with tuberculosis, and he contracted hepatitis B. Until this day, he's undergoing difficult treatment. And this is just one of thousands of similar stories that we hear as our heroes get back from Russian captivity. Just think about it. Currently, in coordination with the coordination headquarters and other agencies that we cooperate, we were able to bring back 3,667 heroes from Russian captivity. I was personally talking to some of them, but all of them talk about tortures, physical, psychological, many of them even mention sexual tortures. My personal story on behalf of Sergei, whom I knew before the full-scale invasion. He is from Berdansk. I was talking to him after he was being treated within half a year after his return from Russian captivity. Just one phrase that, in my opinion, will give you understanding about what was going on. Look, that's a big man, 2 meters tall. And he was weighing 140 kilograms. He said, "Dmytro, there was time when I kneeled down and I started begging Russians to kill me. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't endure such tortures." Within 10 years, we as Ukrainians, as Ukraine, have been crying out loud about it, that Russians violate the Geneva Conventions. All this time, organization that is supposed to do this as their just basic job, exercising their mandate, keeps silent. We were inviting the head of International Committee of Red Cross, whose mission works in Ukraine, to attend this conference. I don't see them in this room, which for an umpteenth time demonstrates their attitude to their mandate. The Russians demonstrate that for them Geneva Conventions are just papers that can be neglected. They spit on them, and ICRC takes the ostrich pose or other pose, but definitely not the pose of a professional organization that is supposed to execute their mandate worthily. Alexander Gritsuk died in captivity. The wife of Alexander says that when his body was brought back, his nose was broken, his head was blue, and his index fingers had no nails. When we brought back other guys who were sharing the cell with Alexander, they said that he was refusing to speak Russian language, for which he was tortured on a daily basis, and eventually, due to the tortures, he died. And that's not a unique story. That's a story that even when in Russian captivity, Ukrainian prisoners of war have the status of prisoners of war, they still get killed by the Russians. This is why I'm publicly saying that Russia eloquently demonstrates to the whole world that they neglect Geneva Conventions. We want to thank the representatives of other international organization, the United Nations organization. For the first time, the reporter on tortures, Alice Edwards, she intentionally had come to Ukraine. She was talking to us. She was talking to those prisoners of war who were set free, and she has become the first human rights person of this international level who presented the first report, which clearly specified that 95% of Ukrainian prisoners of war during their captivity in Russia are being subject to systemic torture, including physical, psychological, and sexual violence. After that, the United Nations Monitoring Mission reconfirmed this information. We want to thank Daniel Bell, the head of the United Nations mission in Ukraine, who worthily fulfilled their job. And to finalize my address, I would like to say that it all happened before. Unfortunately, the problem is that the world doesn't want to draw conclusions from the history. When the World War II was starting, when the aggressor was demonstrating the similar attitude to the civilians, to the prisoners of war, the world was silent. It all resulted in World War II. And it's the fault of international community to whom we're trying to reach out, whom we beg, to whom we cry out loud, so they see our pain and fulfill their job. Condemning Russian Federation urgently, and urgent condemnation is cessation of any cooperation, diplomatic or economic, political, any relations with Russian dictator and Russian Federation. If world doesn't learn its lessons, unfortunately, the World War III is about to start, if it has not started just yet. And then all of the countries will have this document, Moscow Conventions, because they will need to prepare their population, their military for this treatment. This is how Russian Federation will and Russian army will treat them when they come to their countries. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dmytro. Mr. Oleh, unlike Russian Federation, Ukraine complies with Geneva Convention on treatment of prisoners of war. We keep seeing the videos and the photos of the Russian prisoners of war. They're well fed, they have no bruises, they don't bear any signs of tortures. And during our exchanges, we see this drastic difference. Why shouldn't we neglect Geneva Convention if our enemy does so? Glory to Ukraine. I'm a representative of the Coordination Headquarters on Treatment of Prisoners of War, and in order to explain why I've brought these two huge books. Can you imagine? It's 5,500 articles of comments of ICRC to Convention number 3. The third convention obliges us to treat the prisoners of war just as good as possible. And this huge convention is complied with by Ukraine just word for word. Absolutely. Why? The answer is simple. Not to be like Russians. In order not to create any Kiev or Ukrainian convention. Never, ever, whatsoever. So if we can, and if we want to become part of the civilized world, we are already part of the civilized world, we have to work in accordance with the laws of the civilized world. And God forbid us to become like Russians. You can only imagine how it will transform the inclination of the whole civilized world to Ukraine. Let me give you a small example. Recently, there was a huge conference in Geneva that was dedicated, well, it's being held once in 4 years, and it's dedicated to the fulfillment, to current condition of fulfillment of all of the conventions. All of the countries of the world were invited, all their national committees of the Red Cross, more than 4,000 people in total, and we've officially requested the organizers to hold a side event in parallel to demonstrate, to explain to the whole world the way Ukraine complies with the Geneva Convention. There were two huge reasons for that. First, to demonstrate how committed we are to human rights, even while our people are being killed, and to prove to international community, as Commissioner put it, that if there is no proper reaction, you will take our place shortly. You will open the third convention with shaking hands and start building camps and start reading the Convention on Treatment of Prisoners of War and watch Russians with surprise neglecting those Geneva Conventions. And to continue what the Commissioner was saying, the organization committee rejected Ukraine, rejected the offer of Ukraine to hold this side event. The world is living in a warm tub, in an information bubble. They don't want to hear their own words. They feel uncomfortable hearing about our problems, about our tragedies, about our sorrow, both individual and societal. And this is why, to make the world wake up, to make the world see how and with whom they will interact should the conflict start, and that conflict will spread over the territory of those countries so they can see their reality. And the reality is such that Geneva Conventions don't exist for the Russians. And in continuation of what the Commissioner has said, all of the monitoring mechanisms which monitor the state of the human rights in Ukraine, they draw the same conclusion. Those tortures, that inhumane behavior is not an excess of the executioner. That's a systemic policy of the Russian state. The policy of the state, it cannot be imagined in century 21 that a country that is holding an illegal place in the Security Council of the United Nations, which is a part of all of the conventions, they just don't open that convention. They refuse to read it, and they do it intentionally. They do it for purpose. That's the key aspect of it. Our task is communicated to all of you, dear foreign partners, dear foreign colleagues, that if your citizens, if your government officials, those who make decisions, fail to read it, fail to read this book, it's not idealistic, it's realistic. Probably this is when you're going to understand the pain, the horror faced by the Ukrainian society. And we all favor this initiative in order to obviously pull the Western, and not only Western societies, all those who see themselves as democratic, civilized societies, those who live by the laws, the rule of law, to see the flip side of this reality. Because otherwise, this reality will come to you, but it's gonna be too late. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Oleh, Ms. Yevheniia. Many servicemen who were defending Azovstal are still in captivity, but there are such who were set free. What are they telling about the tortures committed by the Russian criminals against the defenders of Azovstal? Well, let me approach it from a specific format, because not everyone is ready, not everyone can tell it, first of all, for the International Criminal Court, and then if they talk about it publicly, all of the biggest cases were set forth in this book. On top of that, we represent the families of the prisoners of war, and we should keep remembering that they live those moments in parallel. Yes, they are somewhere in the safe territory, but the thoughts, what, like every day, what can they do, where to go? And at the moment of the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when our representatives of Mariupol garrison, there was a lot of prisoners of war who walked out from Azovstal facilities, they were facing this reality when, yeah, we have United Nations, we have Red Cross, they were present during evacuation, and there was such a vague hope that all those books that we were reading about respect, about the value of human life, all of those impressions were broken because we were just calling the number that never picked up. In fact, it never existed. It was just an illusion of the philosophers who were born in Europe. And until this day, the majority of us, for example, my brother is still in captivity. He got a status of illegally accused. We know that there are people who got life sentences who are being held in captivity in such places as Black Dolphin or Polar Wolf, where they keep the extremists, and these are the places where they put our guys who were defending their homeland. And when it comes to Moscow Conventions, you know, we were believing the Geneva Conventions. We were thinking that's one of the most beautiful things ever invented by humanity in the history of wars. And we've seen that no matter how much we urge Russia, no matter how much we urge other organizations to urge Russia, they keep writing their same rules. And according to the evidences of those who were set free from captivity, they keep following those rules. It's the result of following those rules by the Russian representatives in the places of captivity. Thank you, Ms. Yevheniia. Ms. Tetiana, the Media Initiative for Human Rights continues collecting evidences of the crimes committed by Russians, specifically in relation to the prisoners of war. What are the patterns that you can track? Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for creation of these Moscow Conventions. Our organization really got involved in preparation of this text. Our lawyer, Andrei Yakovlev, our international lawyer, was editor of this text. And since he's been working with our organization since 2014, he was studying all of the events related to the war. He evaluates them from the point of view of international humanitarian law. And I will allow myself a small remark. Yesterday, my son said that he has a friend whose boyfriend got in captivity under Vovchansk. He was a part of one of the special units, and she said, I cannot read your website, everything looks horrible there. And on our website, we and our analysts, we write about horrible things that in reality for us have become, well, it's a terrible word itself, but they become habitual for us. And I think that those wars should be shared and spread as much as possible so the whole world knows about what's going on in Ukraine. We really document the war crimes and other international crimes. We interviewed those who were set free from captivity, not only after year 23, but even before, those who were exchanged back in 2017, 2019. And during those exchanges, there were prisoners of war set free who were defending Ilovaisk or Donetsk airport. And it's important to mention that Russian Federation uses the same practices for detention of Ukrainian military who were captured in Donetsk airport or Ilovaisk or Debaltseve, and now in many places of our country as well. And as we talk about those practices, we understand that Russia uses those practices behind the closed doors. ICRC was mentioned a couple of times today. United Nations Monitoring Mission was mentioned when they were able to act in the occupied territories, and we're saying that international missions have no access to the places of captivity. No matter how much we hear that ICRC have limited mandate, they keep asking, we still don't believe it. As we interview the servicemen, and in particular from Azov Brigade, we've heard the same answer: no, we've never ever saw any representative of ICRC in any place of captivity. And all those compromises that ICRC agrees to due to reasons that others can understand, we as citizens of Ukraine cannot understand. Our loved ones, our family members are in captivity. And one of our ideas is, if ICRC cannot cope with this situation, and we have to demonstrate it to the world that they cannot cope with it, probably we have to establish another alternative groups that would be able to get access to the places of captivity of prisoners of war. And I'm convinced it would reduce the number of such cases. We talk a lot about tortures today, but the world just let that go. They may just close our website and not read about the tortures because that's real horrific. We can just explain something on top of what's written in Geneva Convention number 3, that, for example, Russian Federation fails to use the right to send information cards on capturing in compliance with Article 70 of Geneva Conventions. They don't report on capturing our military. They don't allow exchanging correspondence. They don't allow exchanging or sending shipments to the prisoners of war. And contrary to the Article 109 of the convention, Russia doesn't exchange the military who have been heavily injured, specifically those who were injured during Azovstal siege or during the Olenivka incident in July 2022. They don't hand over people with amputations and other heavily injured. Why do the Geneva Conventions exist? To restrict another side, the opposite belligerent parties. And when we talk about people with amputations, who have no legs, who have no hands, they cannot fulfill their duty as military. They're not gonna be back to the battlefield as warriors. Russia doesn't take any advantage, from having them. Russia continues persecuting Ukrainian prisoners of war. It's clearly stipulated that it's prohibited to condemn the military for taking part in the war. And what Russian Federation does, they recognize Azov as a terroristic organization, and they accuse them of terrorism. they put them on trial for that, and we're hardly going to find any provision in Geneva Conventions that is in line with what Russian Federation is doing. They may reference Geneva Conventions. This is what we see in some of their accusations. But starting with 2014, Russia, in all the places of captivity, both stationary and other, they use the same treatment, same torturing practices. It tells us about the systemic policy of Russian Federation. It says that the Russian Federation, at the level of the President of Russian Federation, top-level command, they've approved this policy. They approved that they are going to use Moscow Conventions in place of Geneva Conventions. And as we discuss the policy of Russian Federation, we don't talk only about the war crimes. We're saying that Russian Federation commits crimes against humanity, and basically Russian Federation is supposed to be held accountable for this, and to bring them to liability we have to talk about it. I want to thank all of my colleagues, all of the representatives of the government agencies, Azov, those who took part in preparation of this document, the document with which we can come to our partners and non-partners and to show what's going on in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Tetiana, Mr. Bogdan. It was mentioned many times that some international organizations just close their eyes at what Russian Federation is doing. Someone focuses their attention on those crimes, but what does Ukraine do to bring even more attention of the international community to crimes of the Russians and to hold them accountable for neglecting of the provisions of Geneva Convention? Thank you very much. I would like to start that this is the year of the anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, and my colleague from the coordination headquarters has done an ingenious thing, because this is useless paper that is called article by article comments to Geneva Conventions. This is the ideal world that is being reported about by Red Cross, by other international organizations, and here is the reality we live in. And not only us, we're not alone in this reality. This is the reality faced by all of the peoples who were facing Russian aggression within the last 30 years. I would add Syrians to this book. And our task is, we keep talking about it in our diplomatic channels. We keep communicating it to our colleagues, the diplomats who stay in Ukraine. We keep communicating this information through all of our ambassadors and our consular departments in all of the countries where we have diplomatic representation. But classical diplomacy is not going to work if it won't be supported by the civil society of Ukraine, and basically with all of the society of Ukraine, because classical diplomacy may only work when they enjoy the support of people's diplomacy. Because in reality, our task of all of us, of the Ukrainian society, is to make sure that this book is tears and sorrow of the families of the prisoners of war. It's the suffering of the prisoners of war themselves. And it should become not only their problem, it should become the problem of all of our society that is constantly communicated to the international partners. It shouldn't be the story where it's dry law and diplomacy, because the big world is indifferent, and we just can keep proving it and to force the international organizations to work, including the Red Cross, who has immense budgets. Their budgets are only going to grow because it's 75th anniversary, and they expand their activities in Ukraine. And with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, many countries, the governments of many countries allocated funds for local Red Cross societies that were supposed to help Ukraine. However, that help was not always efficient enough, and it's all possible only in that case if we communicated to the whole world that this ideal world may crack as a bubble and transform into this world. And in the same way, Russians are going to neglect your civilians, your soldiers. In the same way, they're going to commit the same things that they commit against Ukrainian prisoners of war and Ukrainian civilians. And furthermore, this is the evidence for International Criminal Court, is the evidence for the future specialized tribunal. And it's our task, because only we can push the international community to have the indictments of International Criminal Court and to have Russia held accountable during specialized tribunal, and every single war crime against Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian prisoners of war is punished. Let me give you the examples. Istanbul Protocol describes 16 forms of torture, and Russia was using at least 14 of them in relation to Ukrainian prisoners of war. And in the same way, we have to continue communicating it to the whole world. Not only foreign diplomats, not only foreign government officials are supposed to know about it, but also every foreign star, big athlete, every single citizen. They should be aware of it. It should be in the agenda of international community, because this is the only way that the global community stopping Russians in Ukraine, punishing them for everything they've committed against our citizens. This is the only way that they may prevent facing something that we keep facing on a daily basis. Thank you, Mr. Bogdan. Russian Federation doesn't only keep military captive, but also the civilians. And at this moment, I would like to invite Ms. Yuliia Paievska to join us online. Ms. Yuliia, good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me and see me? Yes, we can hear and see you. Ms. Yuliia, you were held captive yourself, and now you support all of the processes that are aimed at setting our prisoners of war free. When it comes to civilian prisoners, what are the illegal methods that the enemy uses against them in captivity? What is generally going on there in Russian captivity? Well, what are the methods? All the methods are all the same. They use the whole range of tortures to the civilians in order to force us to recognize the crimes that they accuse us of. Definitely the crimes that we've never committed. But the tortures are used without any hesitation. They don't need any evidences. They just want us to confess about what we never did. What is the work that is being done to draw the attention of international community to the fact that the civilians are also being held captive on par with the military, and the same type of tortures are applied against them? Well, there is a group of people, one of those people who travel the world telling the global community about what's going on. I know that there is a legislation being prepared to amend it. And during the last meeting, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada, well, I've suggested to establish a new organization that could replace Red Cross, which is dysfunctional in Russian Federation and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Well, everybody loved the idea, but the mechanism for establishment of a new organization is not an easy thing. And there is yet another problem about it: how to force Russians to comply with any conventions, any resolutions of international organizations, of international court, how to force them to fulfill the obligations that they've undertaken in relation to Geneva Conventions. So basically, what is the mechanism? We may agree on anything, but you see their attitude, and in my opinion, this is the biggest problem for the time being. Am I understanding it correctly, that the whole global community realizes that the International Committee of Red Cross ceased to exist as a useful structure, and we are in urgent need of a more efficient tool? Well, you know, it's a two-sided coin, because local societies of Red Cross, for example, Ukrainian Red Cross, they work perfectly. I have no problems about them. The same applies to the European, Asian countries' national societies. In America, there's a lot of local offices of Red Cross which completely satisfy all of the requirements. When it comes to International Committee of Red Cross, there are still a lot of questions to them. And there are statements that it's not their fault, it's Russia who fails to admit them. But again, they should do something about it, because the tortures continue. It's going to be 3 years after the beginning of the full-scale invasion soon, but we have other prisoners of war who are being held captive since 2014, both military and civilians. Thank you very much, Ms. Yuliia, for joining us online. If you can, please stay online in case our journalists have any questions to you. And I would like to invite our guests, our journalists, if you have any questions or comments, or if there is something you would like to add, just raise your hand and we'll hand over the microphone to you. Good morning, Anna Samara, Suspilne broadcaster. I'm having a question to Mr. Dmytro about those prisoners of war who are still being held captive. Do we know their number, at least approximate? And what is percentage of those whom whereabouts we're aware of, whose condition we're aware of, and what work is being done to find out where are they physically and to have them exchanged? Thank you very much for your question. Talking about the number of military prisoners of war as well as civilians, do we know the exact number? Let me put it like this. We cannot be 100% sure that we have information about all of the Ukrainian prisoners of war or civilian hostages that we officially got from Russian Federation. But again, it's for the understanding of everybody. International Committee of Red Cross is the only tool using which we can officially get information from Russian Federation. Even when the families of the prisoners of war and those people who got missing, they are aware of it. Even if we see information in media, in Telegram channels, from photos or videos, the official status is still missing in action, because until ICRC officially confirms their status as prisoners of war, we cannot officially recognize them as such. That's why officially we don't have information about all of the Ukrainian citizens who are being held captive by Russian Federation, and that's another result of inefficient activity of ICRC. Are we aware of them through other channels like Main Directorate of Intelligence? Other intelligence agencies are capabilities as the Office of the Commissioner on Human Rights. It gives us the opportunity to say that theoretically we have information about all of the citizens of Ukraine who are being held captive by Russian Federation, either military or civilians, but when we know that there is an approximate number of citizens of Ukraine staying in this or that colony, we still cannot get the comprehensive list name by name. That's why we continue working on it. And talking about ICRC in continuation of what Ms. Taira has said, there are 3 Red Crosses. National Committee of Red Cross, we can only appreciate their input. National Society of Red Cross of Ukraine. Another organization is International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, that comprises all of the national societies. And we have a lot of claims to this organization. Why? Because officially Russian Red Cross is still a part of this organization. It's officially recognized that the Red Cross, the National Society of Red Cross of Russian Federation, were taking part in illegal deportation of Ukrainian children. It's recognized that in violation of the statute of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, they've closed their eyes at Russian Red Cross stealing the property of Ukrainian Red Cross in Crimea and using it publicly. And we cannot seek any reaction from them. They've opened an internal investigation that resulted in nil, zero. Even in relation to Belarusian Red Cross, they've suspended their participation when we've provided the evidences that the head of Belarusian Red Cross had come to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and they were taking part in the promotion campaign of Russian Armed Forces special operation against Ukraine. And there was no reaction on part of the International Federation in relation to Russian Federation, and that's probably because the head of the Russian Red Cross is the part of the board of International Federation, and they were elected in April 2022 when the world was already aware of Bucha and other horrors committed by Russians in Ukraine. And another organization, yet another organization, is ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, the organization who is supposed to protect the rights of the prisoners of war. And we have a lot of claims to them. If they're saying that it's Russians who don't let us in, and we're asking, so where is it documented? If it's not documented, you just agree with the fact that Russians comply with everything. And if they do comply with everything, you're supposed to ensure, just like my colleague properly mentioned, on a monthly basis, the Ukrainian prisoners of war should be entitled to shipments, correspondence, medical aid. Heavily injured and severely sick should be repatriated without any additional conditions back to Ukraine, and it all just doesn't happen. And when I keep emphasizing it with ICRC, I'm telling them your last official report in which you've described that within the last month you visited hundreds of the prisoners of war, but for an umpteenth time you're trying to get access to thousands of prisoners of war. In my opinion, that's bland lies, because what you're supposed to write, that you visited hundreds of Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine, and for an umpteenth time you were rejected by Russian side in visiting Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russia. And this is what's happening within the last 10 years, and their only reasoning is that we're neutral, we're in the independent organization. In my opinion, this statement contradicts our argument, like that, yes, you're neutral, we don't make you discern who is the victim of aggression, who started the aggression, but your neutrality is not supposed to cover your lack of efficiency. You are supposed to be unbiased. If Ukraine complies with these documents, you have to mention it. If Russia fails to comply with them, you have to mention it too. And if you're thinking that Russian Federation is going to oust the mission of International Committee of Red Cross from Russia if ICRC will write about it just one time or even mention it not publicly. Russians, in my opinion, will do everything to make sure that ICRC continues working in Russia, because this is the way that they may show, like, yeah, we comply with everything they call black, white, and ICRC supports them. Yet another question, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Dmytro. Good morning, Army FM, Igor Samoka. Mr. Dmytro, last year you said that the mixed medical commissions may become another tool that will help set our military free, our prisoners of war free. And in compliance with Geneva Convention, Ukraine may appeal a third country to establish such a committee, and the aggressor country still doesn't have them. Is there any progress in negotiations with the third country? And what do we know about it for the time being? Talking about third countries, we have no problems with the partners. Officially, we have one country that helps us directly in returning our prisoners of war back to Ukraine. It's the United Arab Emirates. Talking about contacts with this country, just like with any other countries, regarding additional negotiations with Russian Federation, regarding establishment of the mixed medical commissions, we've fulfilled it. Russians, unfortunately, in my opinion, consciously don't want to do it, because automatically, if they establish the mixed medical commissions, the next step is they're supposed to admit those commissions to every single Ukrainian prisoner of war to document who falls under the category of heavily injured, and then automatically the procedure of repatriation is supposed to start with no conditions. It's no exchange, it's the direct evacuation to the territory of Ukraine. We have a number of countries who are ready to help us, even when it comes to establishment of the new international organizations. Back in 2022, I addressed my colleagues all around the world, the commissioners for human rights. It's our mandate to defend the rights of everybody, including prisoners of war. And if the ICRC fails to prove their efficiency, we, as commissioners for human rights, may start another organization. We started communication. I have a number of my colleagues who expressed not only their interest to take part in this organization, who started physically taking some steps. My Turkish colleague has come to Ukraine. We've provided access to the Russian prisoners of war, and he made a public statement that I've submitted a request, an appeal to the Russians, so he gets admitted to Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russia. And until this day, we're waiting for a public response. His visit was agreed and then failed to get agreed. But again, the response of other international organizations may be the same, like Russia provides no access to the prisoners of war. But at least we may be saying it out loud. The next question is going to be in English language. Whoever needs the translation devices, please use them.
Good morning. My name is Lorenzo Cremonesi from the Italian daily Corriere della Sera. Sir, yeah, I understand your problems in giving us precise figures about the prisoners. But before you say that you freed 3,067, these are, first of all, civilian or soldiers? I didn't get it. Because we know that you have regular exchanges of prisoners with the Russians, so maybe you can divide and you can understand. And then, please, it's very important from a journalistic point of view to try to give an idea of the dimension. We are not asking you a precise number, but to have an idea how many prisoners you have. 50,000, 10,000, 3,000. I mean, some idea of the number. And I have a second question, and it is this one. I understood this, which is for everybody, of course. Understood this methodical use of torture, of abusing prisoners in Russia. Is this why? For information, for physical, psychological pressure? Why they do that? Thank you.
Я
Let me start, and then I will give the floor to my colleagues. I apologize for talking this much. So talking about the figures, 3,767 includes 168 civilians. The rest of them are the military prisoners of war. This is the number that we've brought back through the procedure of exchange, prisoners of war against prisoners of war. The number of those still remaining in Russian captivity, we don't give anybody this number, but according to our calculations, according to our official calculations, we're talking about dozens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens being held in Russian captivity, both military prisoners of war and civilian prisoners. And when it comes to motivation, why do Russians torture Ukrainians? In my opinion, that's an intentional, conscious policy. I can underwrite every single word of my colleagues who've said that according to our conclusions is the conscious, intentional policy of Russian Federation in relation to Ukrainian citizens. And you're absolutely correct. In our opinion, we should legally recognize that Russians commit the war crime of genocide, at least when it comes to illegal deportation of Ukrainian children. The International Criminal Court issued 2 warrants for Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, and the legal background was illegal deportation of Ukrainian children. And we think that the International Criminal Court has all of the legal reasons not only to initiate a case, but to issue the following arrest orders for the heads of other government offices of Russian Federation for committing the war crime of genocide. The 5 elements of crime of genocide, according to our legal analysis, the Russian Federation has committed all 5 of them starting from the year 2014 and unfortunately continues committing. Does anybody want to add something? Well, when it comes to the numbers, you should understand that during the active phase of the armed conflict, discussing the number of the prisoners of war on both sides would be not so correct from the military perspective. Please get us right. Talking about the number of those whom we've exchanged, you're seeing this structure, 168 civilians and about 3,500 military, which means that in case of civilians, it's way more difficult to exchange them, to repatriate them, because they are beyond legal field, and Russians commit a lot of war crimes. They execute death penalties without any responsibility. Let me repeat it. It's real difficult to find the civilians and to bring them back, let alone the children who are being indoctrinated in Russia. Talking about your second question, the motivation. Well, for what we can say that their motivation lies in 2 areas. First, to continue keeping the anti-humane sentiment, the cruel sentiment inside their post-Soviet Russian society, because the main mover of this war is the hatred of Russians against Ukrainians, and they have to keep the degree of this hatred high. And another aspect, in our opinion, is that Russians want to transform Ukrainian society into a biomass that is afraid of Russians. And if you're afraid, you cannot counteract in a way that we contract now. They're doing it both for Russian society and for Ukrainian society with different goals, with different motivation, but they want us just to cease resisting and to continue keeping the degree of hatred high in the Russian society. Well, I agree with my colleagues, specifically when it comes to the statement that one of the motivations is to intimidate Ukrainians, to break our will to resist, to have us capitulate. But yet another goal is cynical and practical from Kremlin perspective. They're trying to destroy the international humanitarian law and to replace it with the rule of force that, in their opinion, will allow them achieve their geopolitical ambitions. Well, I will allow myself a short comment. The first reason why Russia does it, why specific particular Russians do that in places of captivity, well, there's a number of reasons in our opinion. First is because the regime allows Russians to do so. Well, a lot of things are allowed behind the closed doors, and when you understand that nobody is going to open those closed doors, no prosecutor, no judge, and those regular Russians, those average Russians, they are convinced they can avoid accountability, and then Russians, it's in their nature, we see it in surveys, they just love it. They love torturing Ukrainians. This is how they can prove themselves. And we understand that those practices, they are no new. Russia is the successor of the Soviet Union. Our organization is preparing another report, the historic parallels about what was going on back in 30s and 60s in the concentration camps in Russian Federation, in the Soviet Union. Moldova hasn't gone anywhere. Moldova is still here. Well, and we have another question for you. We have time for it, another question. I apologize. Just two questions in one. Daniela Dovlatova, Vikna News. Well, we keep saying, like, okay, how can we force the Red Cross to work? How can we force Russia to comply with the Geneva Conventions? But I'm curious, what do we do? Say we live in a world where no one cares about us. Well, other countries, Russians only care about us dying, and we cannot give a monkey a spoon and force it to eat with the spoon. And in the same way, we cannot give Russians the Geneva Conventions and to tell them, like, go comply with them. But what are the specific steps that we can take to, I don't know, to expedite the process of Ukrainian prisoners of war being set free, to protect them as they stay in captivity? And second, what are we doing for the civilian hostages? Because for what I know, the Ukrainians, I mean the civilian prisoners who got back, they have no social payments or other opportunities. For what I know, there was a resolution approved for them to postpone their mobilization, but on top of that, I haven't seen anything similar. I hope I'm not confusing you with my question, and thank you in advance for your answers. Let me start. So first, what are we doing? You're seeing the results, right? If we make it bringing back our people, it means we've done something, even despite the fact that Russian Federation was refusing any exchanges from the beginning of the war. In my opinion, the Russians only understand the language of force. They don't get you otherwise. I don't quite agree with you that no one cares about them, because otherwise Putin would have been in Kiev already. We would have lost. Well, even despite not only Russia waging a war against us, we can confidently say that it's Russian Federation, North Korea, and Iran waging a war against us. And according to the evidences from a reputed newspaper, we may state that China provides military aid to the Russian Federation. And all those countries are dictatorships. That's what's different about their system of governance. And on the other hand, Ukraine and currently about 70 other democratic countries who support Ukraine in different ways, diplomatically, financially, providing military aid, but we're all standing together. So what should we do next? We need, I apologize, it may sound as a revelation for somebody, the Ukrainian Commissioner for Human Rights is caring about human rights, but I am requesting my colleagues, other commissioners for human rights, please press on your governments so your governments help Ukraine by providing military aid, specifically military aid, because how do we down the Russian missiles without the modern air defense systems? But it's about the human rights too. F-16, when we were requesting them, I was explaining it to my colleagues that we see those aircraft as an efficient measure to down Russian drones and missiles that they attack us with every single night. That's our right to protect ourselves, right to defend ourselves. And please understand that it's not about Ukraine, it's about the democratic world. Russians want to destroy this democratic world. They will come after you if we don't win, Russians, here in Ukraine. So get prepared to the war. But it's way better for you to prepare for the war with Russia by helping us when you're saying like we're supposed to continue economic cooperation with Russians because it's our economy. We explain it to them that economic advantages you're getting now are so infinitesimal if Russians start waging a war against you. Forget about economics. It's a matter of survival. So we try to present them in a good sense. We try to explain things with a team of civil organizations, experts, journalists. We present this document today that will serve as another evidence for all of the international partners to cease any cooperation with Russians. Should all of the world at the level of United Nations or other organizations just say, yeah, we understand Russians are supposed to be stopped immediately, we start thinking about full embargo of Russian oil and gas, everybody. So what do you think? How long would Russian economy last in conditions like this? They would not even come to this. They would immediately say, yeah, we're ready to talk. Unfortunately, the world is not perfect now, and Ukraine is changing it. And the formula of peace of Ukraine is our answer to how we should approach the general rules. And I believe that international community still has a chance to stop Russians here in Ukraine, because otherwise we all agree here that this war will come to their homes and it will make things way worse. That's why let's continue pressing, let's continue uniting the whole globe around our country, let's reinforce our armed forces of Ukraine. This is, in my opinion, the most efficient tool to bring Ukrainian prisoners of war back to Ukraine. Thank you and glory to our armed forces. Well, me as a sister of a prisoner of war, you know, it seems that it's a little bit devaluating that we are silent. I mean, we're crying out loud about it. This project, what to do, it has specific steps. You take those materials and you share them. You will help us a lot as a media. We keep doing it for a third year, what the civil organizations are doing within years, and now we're sitting here and we're discussing what can be done. First, follow the link, find the materials, find the physical media. You can share information online, you can translate it through the coordination headquarters, Office of the Commissioner, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are all here to do this. We've also involved creative agency Banda, and we were able to convey the emotions, because here we're talking about the law, about the rights, and now we're getting involved in such a profound influence over the society and other organizations. So that's it on my end. Thank you very much. I think we need to finalize a presentation on these words. Whoever hasn't got a copy, please get it as you leave. And let me remind you, we've just had a presentation of the Moscow Conventions on Treatment of Prisoners of War. I want to thank all of the guests for this important topic, and Ukrainian Media Center will continue at 1300. We will continue discussing the crimes of the Russians, specifically childhood in captivity, how to protect the rights of the children under occupation. Stay tuned. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.